we find ourselves today, the 5th Sunday of Lent already. Doesn't it seem like just yesterday was Ash Wednesday, but here we are, my dear friends of Christ, nearing ever more closely to Holy Week and to Easter glory. But until then, let's focus on today's second reading from the letter to the Hebrews. We hear that, I'll read it to you. It was chapter 5 in Hebrews 7-9. In the days of the flesh, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard for his godly fear. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. We hear, my dear friends of Christ, in this very short passage from a relatively longer letter, that Christ suffers. And he learns obedience through this suffering. My dear friends of Christ, what we do not hear, though, is the fuller context from which this excerpt is taken. The fuller context is the priesthood. And most especially, the high priest. The high priest, as you know and remember, would go into the Holy of Holies once a year, the Day of Atonement. He would go into the most holy, the most sacred part of the temple, and it would be there, bringing blood with him, that he would sanctify the altar and then ask for the remission of all the sins of the Israelites. It was only the high priest, and again, only once a year, who would enter into the Holy of Holies. Anyone else would die. But the high priest was able to go in. The letter to the Hebrews, my dear friends of Christ, calls Jesus the high priest. It is the only letter in all of sacred scripture that references Jesus as the high priest. Jesus does not simply go into the temple once. He goes in continually because he himself is the temple. He is the Holy of Holies. And he too brings blood. Blood for atonement, blood for redemption, blood for sanctification. His own blood. Jesus is the great high priest who not only offers the sacrifice, but is himself the sacrifice. He is the priest and the victim and the altar on which the victim is sacrificed. He is all that in one. Jesus is our great high priest, and immediately after what I just read to you earlier, we hear that Jesus was designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. That Melchizedek is not an order of priesthood that was passed from father to son, but rather a priesthood that is passed from father to son. Jesus, the Son. Saints in the making, knowing that Jesus is our high priest, let us follow his example and let us obey as he himself obeyed. Let us learn obedience through our own daily sufferings, however minor, inconvenient, or annoying they might very well be. You and I, like Jesus, we can learn obedience through suffering. And that suffering, like Jesus' suffering, can be redemptive because he redeems all suffering by taking it on himself and dying on the cross. Let us today, saints in the making, look at suffering very differently. Let us look at obedience very differently. And let us do so by making space for grace.